Okay, great. All right, we'll begin. Good evening once again. Now we're on the middle of the lecture series for 2025, the summer lecture series called Choosing Assimilation. Tonight is the third lecture, which is called The Challenge of the Christian Middle Ages. The Assimilation Challenge of the Christian Middle Ages, of course. This is being sponsored, you can see, by the Elmans, by Linda and Michael Elmans. And remember, their beloved parents, that's Julius Feigelman, Bernice Feigelman, Leonard Rubin, and Beatrice Rubin. And Shama Shehem, as they say. Thank you very much. Now, to get down to business, here we're dealing with the challenge of the Christian Middle Ages. Last time we did about the world of the Middle East, Islam, and all that. They had their way of doing things. But as you know, a lot of Jews, not the majority, but a lot of Jews, ended up not in the Islamic empire, but in what you and I call the Christian part. So what do we mean when we talk about the Christian Middle Ages? That's a machlokes, but basically, figure from the time the Roman Empire switched to Christian, which is in the 300s, okay? The Emperor Constantine, he changed from being pagan to Christian. And then for another 1,000 years or so, 1,100 years. That's what we call the Middle Ages, Christian Middle Ages. And we call it the Age of Faith, because during this 1,000 years, there's no skepticism or atheism or anything like that. There are two teams, okay? As you can see over here, let's go to the first one. There are two teams, the Muslim world, the Christian world. And they're always fighting each other. But these guys are fighting among each other more than they're fighting the others. That's why they couldn't really win against the Muslims. And the terrorists today are trying to rebuild this. That what they call about a caliphate, like the ISIS and all that, they want all this and more to be under one ruler. That's what the terrorism is all about. Okay? And then they'll take it from there. But that's the goal. So that means that there are two teams, the Orioles and the Yankees, and there aren't any others. And then there are Jews who live in small little groups among them. You understand? There's a gigantic Islamic world with a couple of Jews. There's a big Christian world, which we call Christendom, with a couple of Jews. The only difference is that for hundreds of years, the Islamic empire was united. It was one big empire. The Christians never could get their act together in one empire, and therefore everybody's broken up into different kingdoms, always fighting each other. That's how it works. Okay? Tonight we're talking about the Christian team. What was it like for Jews to live in medieval Christendom? And what about assimilation there? In terms of religious differences, and remember, the religious differences are all important in the Middle Ages. They're coming back to be right now. But when we were younger, it's more of a secular kind of world. It's not supposed to count so much. But the 21st century is making, mincemeat out of that. And as the 21st century proceeds, the religious definition of a person is like more definitional, more important than before. And so, in American politics, it's turning that way. And in Europe, it's turning that way. And the Middle East, it's always been that way. So we're talking about the Christian team. What was it like for Jews there? In terms of religious differences, from the Jewish point of view, the dominant Christianity in the Middle Ages, the Christian religion that they encountered in the Middle Ages, the change under Constantine from pagan to Christian really meant to Jews the transition from one kind of avodah zarah to another. They didn't really regard it as some kind of new monotheistic religion. This is a whole book by Professor Katz, Jacob Katz, No Relation. So what has been the view of Judaism or Jews towards Christianity in the form that they encountered it. Now there are many different varieties of Christianity, and as you know, and I wouldn't say, for example, the Jews mainly encountered the Armenian church or the Coptic church of Ethiopia. There are no Jews there. But the Catholic Church, the Greek Orthodox, those kind of things, yes, they did. Okay? Now, to them, Jews viewed this as a kind of a avodah zarah because you believe in three gods. The Christians say, no, we really believe in one God. The Jews say, no, it's really three. And you have statues, and then the Christians say, we're not really worshiping the statues. And the Jews say, you are worshiping the statues, etc., etc., etc. You understand? So, by the time this happened, in the Roman Empire, which was in the early 300s, the Jews before that had actually assimilated into the Roman Empire, as evidenced by the famous decree of the Emperor Caracalla in the early 200s, in which he gives the Jews complete and total civil rights, equal citizenship in the empire. Now, in Eretz Yisrael, you had politics. So there, the situation was always toxic. But outside of Israel, there's a huge Roman Empire. And as you know by now, Jews lived all over the place. For example, in Spain, in what we call today France, in Italy, North Africa, a place like that. And what was the relation of Jews and the Roman Empire? I don't say they liked each other, but the Jews had been there for hundreds of years. What do? This one has this business, that one has that business, they're in trade, they're whatever they are. And the Jews outside of Israel had no politics, and so they're just part of the furniture, as I say before. And the Romans had gotten used to them. And as I say before, in the early 200s, they actually gave them citizenship. And that means, as you can see over here, all these things, and these are only a few. You can see the Jewish communities, and there are a lot more than what you see over here. So Israel is Israel, and here was a separate, special problem of nationalism and that sort of thing, which is a very unfortunate story. During the period, you look at it over here, Jews, for example, are not allowed to live in Yerushalayim after the Bar Kokhba rebellion, just to give you an example. But outside of Israel, it wasn't so bad. Listen, the Jews held public office. In fact, they were required to, in the municipal level, in the Roman Empire. So we don't usually think like that the city council of Milan, or of Paris, whatever it was called at that time, because there was a place like that, or Vienna, which has some kind of a name also, and other communities throughout the empire, they had a mayor and a city council and all the rest of it, and that included Jews, you see? And this is under the gold days under the pagans. And now it's going to switch to Christians, it's going to be very different. So, the Jews were fairly assimilated into the Roman Empire in the sense of externals. Not religion, but externals. They dressed Roman. The Jews spoke Latin or Greek. As we said, they read the Sefer Torah in Greek. In the synagogue, which is a Greek word, okay? And probably davened in Greek. If you know anything about Josephus, the famous historian from that time, and he lived just before the Churban Beis HaMikdash, before the year 70. Because as you know, he was a witness to that. So like in the 60s, I think it was, he talks about the fact that there was an incident where a couple of Jews were arrested by the Romans for something or other, I forget what, and sent as galley slaves or something, salt mines. And naturally, the Jews in Israel and Yerushalayim got together a Pidyon Shvuim type committee to go to lobby in Rome to get a pardon from Trump, or something like that, right? Or buy him out. And he says that he was one of them, and he went on a ship traveling from Israel to Rome, and it was a shipwreck because it was a storm, and everybody drowned, and he's the only one that made it to shore in South Italy. And Schlepzach, he walked, from where the ship landed, eventually got to Rome. He doesn't know anybody there, but I forget the exact details, but he met somebody who was part of Hollywood, of Broadway. That's a better way of putting it. And he said, I'll bring you and introduce you to my friends. A lot of these actors were Jewish. They weren't from. They're starring in the Roman theater. And one of them says, I knew the empress, Poppaea Sabina, because Nero had married an actress. It's notorious. And Poppaea Sabina was like sympathetic to Judaism. She probably had been one of these people that earlier on had been to the synagogue a couple times. And by the time the story's over, this guy who was an actor who didn't keep anything, like I said before, he lived in Broadway scene, in Rome of all places. You can imagine what that was like. Yeah, but he helped them and he got the prisoners out. So I'm trying to tell you, that guy, that actor, whoever he was, his friends, they're assimilated Jews, but they're Jewish. And they have the Jewish button. You could touch the button. So that's what had been under the good old days of the paganism. despite all the trouble we've all had with the Roman Empire. What was the relationship of these communities that you see over here to, let's put it this way, Rabbinic Judaism? Like in Israel, of the rabbis? Well, anybody knows the first Mishnah in Gittin will remember that maybe Gittin Medina Siyam Sel Shel Fani Necham, that when you bring a document from overseas to Israel, you have to recite a certain formula because Ein Mekim Lishma. Because overseas, in the Medinas Hayam, these are the Medinas Hayam, the provinces across the sea, right? The provinces of the Roman Empire. And they're, in this case, bringing a get to Israel from somewhere. So let's say, for example, the husband was here and his wife is over here, because otherwise he wanted to bring the get there, and he was convinced, and maybe he was a jerk, and he won't get back out or something. I finally came over here and they convinced him, and he sent the get with a shliach to here, and they have to say, well, make sure it was lishma. Meaning, they didn't follow or know, often, the basic rules. Now, don't ask me what they did. Nobody knows. So there were Jewish communities everywhere. There were basins all over the Medina Siyam, but they weren't very learned. And they were subpar, as we would say today, even in matters like divorce, speaking from a lawyer from a jurisprudential point of view. How that worked in actual practices, who knows? Because if that divorce wasn't executed according to the dotting the I's and crossing the T's, I reason I have Rabbi Henkin. This is a famous Rabbi Henkin from, some of us will remember. And when he was very young, this 100 years ago, 120 years ago, in Lithuania, he gradually, he became a rabbi in Georgia. Not Atlanta, Georgia, Georgia, in the Caucasus. And for a couple years. And he went there were Jews living there, exactly what I'm describing. They didn't know much about Rabbinic Judaism. They're good Jews. Did they know exactly what an Erev is? Did the Shechita go, and did the Shabbos go, buh? And did the marriage and divorce go according to the Shulchan Aruch and all that? The answer is like it's don't ask, right? And he's famous that he was there 5-6 years, I forget how long. He was very, very diplomatic. If you knew him, he was that type of person. Very diplomatic. And little by little, he very gently led them towards what we would say today more halachic conformity. You understand? So I remember Rabbi from Elizabeth, New Jersey, Tice, visited the Soviet Union in 1956. I read this, and he went to a slaughterhouse, a shechita house in Georgia, and they still had the handwritten instructions, Rabbi Henkel, on the wall 50 years later. Understand? Which means, now what about all the people that were married and divorced and they all beforehand? Don't ask, right? Don't ask. So that's what it was like in those days, at the time of the Mishnah. When the Roman Empire switched to Christian, the Jews were for the first time the odd man out. Now it starts to get tough for the Jews. Why? Suppose you lived before Constantine, and suppose I'm in a Roman restaurant. You're a worshiper of Mithra, and you're a worshiper of Zeus, and you do, whatever, the Isis and Osiris and Horus, and you do the gods of Gaul, and everybody does their thing. So this one goes, before he eats the food, she goes, woo, and this one goes, ba ba ba, and the Jew makes a bracha, and you know how it goes. The world is full of, everybody thinks the same thing, the world is full of strange people, and everybody gets along because we're all different. So it's basically like walking down a street in downtown Manhattan. This one looks like this one like this. The Hasidic guy doesn't stand out. You understand? Because next to him is an African guy, the next to him is a Chinese guy, the next one's a this, that, and the other. So when the world was pagan, it was kind of easier for the Jew, because he was one of many. But when the world switches, as it does in the Roman Empire pretty darn quickly after Constantine, that everybody's Christian, all of a sudden, everybody in the room belongs to one club and I don't. Everybody in this room is Christian and I'm the exception. That already makes it much more difficult, as you can understand. When the Roman Empire collapsed 100 years later in the 400s, the Jews found themselves under the barbarians. So as you can see over here, this wasn't a good time because these two kingdoms they'll be able to live in, anybody beyond that was like either killed or forced to convert. We lose all track of them. And so it wasn't an easy time for the Jews when the Roman Empire fell apart. And that's just what it was. Now, as we'll see, there were two groups, the Goths and the Goths, the East Goths and the West Goths. And they're German tribes, and they took over territories of the Roman Empire, as you can see. So pretty much the empire of the Ostrogoths is Italy and some territory north of it. And the territory of the Visigoths is Spain, pretty much. And there they allowed the Jews to live and be okay, because they wanted to Romanize more. But north of here, you have real barbarians and the Franks and who knows what, and they're still half savages and half this. And if there are any Jewish communities among them, all of a sudden we lose all track of them, which means they're gone. Okay. Now, here the Jews did not really assimilate in these empires, kingdoms. The Jews were distinct from the barbarians, and they were hated for not accepting Christianity like everybody else. Like the modern Hasidim, the most likely is the Jews there probably continued to dress Roman style amidst the barbarian rulers. In other words, now that the Franks are in charge, the Lombards, the Magyars, the Huns, and all these other, the Avars, and all these other tribes, the Jews continue to dress like they had dressed under the Roman Empire. That's the Hasidim. The Hasidim dressed like they did in Poland 500 years ago. So therefore, they looked different than everybody else, and they didn't like it. But it's not America. If you don't like it, you kill them. And that was the situation of the Jews in most of these European territories at that time. Luckily for the Jews, the ruling powers, and now we're dealing with the Christian Middle Ages, there's going to be two ruling powers, the kings and the rulers on the one hand, and the church on the other. They have the power. They split it, you understand? The church is in charge of the religious side of things, and the kings are in charge of the civil side of things. The ruling powers, on their own, evolved policy positions which allowed the Jews to survive, out of their own. In the case of the Roman Catholic Church, basically it boiled down to a policy that the Jews can survive but not thrive. Okay? Which means, and this is Pope Gregory the Great in the 500s, that you can't kill them. Well, let me put it this way. The Christians from day one had all kind of attitudes towards the Jews. And this one said they're all wicked for rejecting Jesus, and let's kill them, which makes sense. And the other one said that, and the other one said that. Without going into the whole treatise here on church doctrine, St. Augustine, they named a place in Florida after somebody. St. Augustine, he said, the Jews are mixed up monotheists, but you can't ignore the fact that Jesus was Jewish. You can't ignore the fact that the disciples were Jewish. I don't know why they're so blind that they can't see the truth and all the rest of it, but, God didn't put Jesus in Egypt. He didn't put him in China. Must be some reason. So, wait. And sooner or later, the Jews will see the light. So the bottom line is like this. Don't harm them physically. Okay? You can do everything else. And you should. So you should segregate them, and you should have legal disabilities against them, and you should discriminate against them, and make them feel the suffering for their stupidity and their inability to see the truth and all that, but don't hit them. You know what I mean? No, don't physically harm them. So they can survive but not thrive. And the idea behind this was, that this will be a proof of the truth of Christianity. Because people will say, you see, they're afraid that many people, they're trying to convert them, they'll say, hey, Jesus was Jewish, and these are Jews, and they say he wasn't anything. And they should know better. So, the idea goes like this. The Jews would be like gypsies, impoverished gypsies. They don't have a country, they don't have any shoes on, they're living in degraded state. You understand? And you'll ask them and they'll say, once upon a time long ago we had a kingdom and a temple and an empire and all the rest of it. And then we lost it. And when did you lose it? Roughly around the time of Jesus. Roughly. Oh? So post hoc ergo propter hoc. And this is a proof that you should join the winning team, because look what happened to the losing team. That was the theory behind it, so you can survive, not thrive. Now that's not the way it actually worked out in the Middle Ages, but that was the theory. And it's a good thing for the Jews that they worked out this theory in their own. Otherwise, they say like this, why let him alive at all? If they kill Jesus, then why should you let him alive? Go kill him. You understand? So it's a good thing they worked out in their own minds this way of looking at it. In the case of the civil rulers, the policy became one of service and long-sufferance, which means that if you're a Christian king, or a prince, or princess, or duchess, or anything like that, a pope, you don't have to let him in, and there's no principled reason you should let him in. But if you feel it can help you make some money, you can let him in, of economic utility. And the idea is, I'll let you in as long as it's in my interest. So it's my house, and I'm letting you sit in my house on my porch. But understand this well, anytime I want to, I can kick you out because it's my house. You know, just because you're here for a while doesn't mean you have a right to be here. It's totally on sufferance. Remember what did Shylock say in Shakespeare's Merchant of Venice? Sufferance is the badge of our tribe. Sufferance means over here, I tolerate you. It's Old English, right? So you're here because you have a certain utility, and when you don't have the utility, then get out of here, okay? So whenever the Jews were expelled from a country or someplace in the Middle Ages, in the Christian countries, they couldn't say you don't have a right to do it, they could only beg. You understand? Sometimes it works out, or bribe. It could work or not work. But these are the rules of the game, okay? Having said that, in this environment, the experience of the Jews was going to be different, as were the possibilities as well as the impossibilities of assimilation, because you're in a very hostile environment, and what exactly are you assimilating to? A culture that hates you. Because all of Europe now goes Christian. Little by little, through conquest and persuasion, they spread the Christian religion from the Roman Empire all across the rest of Europe. Christianity was not like paganism or Zoroastrianism or even Islam, which the Jews had experience with before, because those religions have no interest whatsoever in Judaism. I'll say it again. Paganism, which they had in the Roman Empire and the Greek world, Zoroastrianism, which you had in Persia, and even Islam, don't give a darn about Judaism. They consider it junk. And I understand Islam has Jewish roots, but they won't admit it. You understand? They won't admit it. And so they'll say, we're totally uninterested in anything the Jews have to say. On the other hand, Christianity's very self-definition relates to Judaism. The church early on defined itself as the real Jews. Veris Israel, the true Israel. Because after all, Jesus is Jewish. And if you read the New Testament, he doesn't talk about the nations of the world. He said, I'm going to go redeem the Jews. Unless you say like this, by me coming to become a Christian, to believe in Jesus, I'm now becoming a Jew. The right kind of Jew, not the wrong kind of Jew. So that means you're very interested, if you're a theologian and you're a philosopher, and the Catholic Church has abounded in those, in what exactly is Judaism. So in other words, they're trying to work out in their own mind the relationship between the Old Testament and the New Testament. Because after all, they admit that God gave the Old Testament, if you're a Christian. So what do you mean, he changed his mind? Well, not exactly. So what do you mean? So what I'm trying to say is, see, if you're Christian in the Middle Ages, you're very, very, very interested in what exactly Judaism is. Now, Christians therefore had to develop a way of reading the Old Testament, obviously. Because if it says in the Old Testament, you can't eat pork, how do you do that? Just to give you one example. Well, God changed it. It doesn't say God changed his mind. Jesus never said God changed his mind. How do you do that? You have to read the Old Testament with the right lenses. No, I'm serious, through a certain midrash, Christian midrash, So I'm not a Christian, so I can't read the midrash, but they have an entire school of that sort of thing, and that's what they became used to reading it. The view towards the people who inhabit the Old Testament, God keeps saying, my people Israel, I care about what happens with Israel. It's all about the kings of Israel. It's not about the rest of the world. And now you see these Jews over here, and they don't look like God's chosen people. They don't act that way. So why would God choose them? But on the other hand, you're a Christian, so you have to say that it's true. So they had all these issues that they had to work out among themselves. And the Jews were living there, that's why this matters, okay? Now, throughout the ages, till today, Western Christianity, not the Eastern Church. The Eastern Church is like Islam. They say, the heck with anything Jewish. Western Christianity will be fascinated with Judaism because, after all, as I said before, Jesus practiced Judaism in the New Testament. By contrast, the Jews in the Middle Ages, especially Judaism, has no opinion on Jesus or on Christianity. Okay, they're not. Here's a book that came out a couple years ago from Professor Shinat, Oto Aish. Oso Aish, that man, like Jesus. What's the Jewish view in Jesus? Well, this is the Rambam's opinion. He has a chapter. This is what Rashi says. This is what this one says. This one says. Well, what's the opinion of Judaism? There is no opinion of Judaism. Get it? Because the Jews always had the ideas like this. I don't even know if the whole thing happened. If it happened, who says it happened this way? And anyway, it was some fake. So I have no opinion on it. That's actually very insulting. Don't tell this to your friends, you know. It's actually very, you know, because I'll say it again. The church has whole commissions on how do you understand Judaism and all the rest of it. The Jews have no commissions on how to understand the New Testament. You see? So really, that's like an ultimate diss. And the Christians didn't like that, okay? Indeed, for the entirety, almost the entirety of the Middle Ages, most Jews, despite outside pressures, were not tempted to convert to Christianity or attracted to its message. We might have to modify that a little bit. There were some, but overall not. The ruling faith was seen by Jews as, number one, Golos Ego. So in other words, in the famous dream of Daniel, right? He says he sees four great monsters, four great beasts coming out. And this beast looked like this, and this beast looked like that. Let's go back to the other one. He says, after there's a leopard with wings and so forth, and then the last one was particularly scary. And that was, in my vision, that there was before me a fourth beast, terrifying and frightening, very powerful. It had large iron teeth. It crushed and devoured its victims and trampled underfoot whatever was left. It was different than all the others and had 10 horns. And now go to the picture. And there it is, okay? You know, so that's how the Jews used the Roman Catholic Church and Christianity, and the Golos had them in the Roman Empire, and that's the Golos they're under. By the way, the idea behind that is like this. And after this one is over, comes the Mashiach. Because that's what the story in Daniel is. You see? So, the Jews weren't interested in learning Christian theology and all that sort of thing. And number two, they viewed it as idolatry. Okay, they viewed it as idolatry. And the truth of the matter is, if you're in a real intense Catholic environment in the Middle Ages, it's not true they just look at the statues as just some symbol of something. People don't kiss the feet, and if you know the Spanish, they'll go on their knees and all that sort of thing. And the Jews like it's Mam Shabbat. Nothing has changed since the time of Abraham and Terah. That's how the Jews viewed it, okay? May I also point out, in Catholicism, which is the down Middle Ages, you have the whole thing of the Mass, in which you're eating the body and blood of Christ. So go tell a Jew, when I'm eating the wafer, I'm eating the body, and then drinking the blood. And by the way, if you're a Catholic, especially in the Middle Ages, it really does happen. That's called transubstantiation. So, first of all, Jews, what I'm trying to say is, you know, look at Rashi. He's going to look at somebody in the Mass. You understand? Now, everybody looks at somebody else's religion as crazy. I get that. But from a Judaic point of view, it's like really weird. And even if you tell me, like the Protestants later on, that it's symbolic, you're eating them? That don't make any sense to the Jew. You see? So I'm just trying to tell you, these are the reasons that the Jews had these attitudes towards the outside world. So don't look for too much assimilation to these core Christian concepts in the Middle Ages from the Jews. Now, by the way, this attitude of the Jews of looking down upon them really ticked off the church, who could not assimilate the fact that the church's doctrines and rituals would seem strange and even pagan to a Jew. The church could only attribute this to the natural perversity and to the influence of devil. Okay? Because why did the Jews see that this is inherently true? Okay? Religion in the Middle Ages will be a totalizing force in European culture, especially in the first half. What I mean by that is, here is a very important difference. This is the Middle Ages. So there's two teams, the Orioles and the Yankees. So the Christians are here and the Muslims are here. I told you last time, what's happening among the Muslims? There's a whole secular culture that's developing alongside the religious culture. In other words, there's major stuff in Islam, and that's certainly true, no question about it. But there was also a major cultivation of what we call today math and science, of the secular disciplines, and geography and history the way they understood it at that time. Like I said before, we've all heard of Arab numbers and algebra, right? And they did stuff in astronomy and all this other they did. So if you're Jewish and you're interested, like Saadi Gun, one of these guys, maybe you're into geometry. Why not? Okay? Maybe you're into philosophy, who knows? You don't have to be a Muslim to be that. There's nothing religious about mathematics or chemistry or optics or that, whatever the Aristotelian sciences were. Now let's go to Christianity and compare that in the Middle Ages. There's no secular. The church dominated everything. You understand? That's the way they want it. You understand? So in other words, there's no bookstores. In Baghdad or Cairo, there are bookstores. You can go buy a math book if you want, or a poetry book. In Paris, so to speak, it's all Catholic. Any book in the store is about the religion. The lives of the saints. Now, by the way, the Christians, to be fair, did very impressive things in terms of the development of medieval Christian civilization, and the monks and the monasteries and all that kind of stuff, if you're into that. That's true. There's no interest to a Jew whatsoever. There's nothing to do with Jew. And there's nothing in math and science, so there's no Barnes & Noble, there's no TV, there's no internet, there's no nothing. So you can already see, what is a Jew going to assimilate, in the sense of pick up from the outside culture? I can't pick up a book in science, there isn't any. And whatever scholarship, and all the books are written in Latin. And nobody spoke Latin, except the priests. Some of them, right? Nobody spoke Latin. And so, whatever books there are in a language that if you're Jewish, you can't access 99%. As opposed to living in the Arab world, everybody could read Arabic, as I told you last time. And so it's like living in America. I don't care how from you are. You can go to a library if you want to and get a book. You can read it. But not if you live in Paris in the time of Rashi. So understand this, okay? Now, don't be surprised if this is going to have a powerful effect on Ashkenazi Jewish culture. I'll get to that a little bit later. But from a Christian point of view, it's like a yeshiva mashgiach's dream. They can't get to TV, and they can't get to a library, and the internet doesn't exist, and all you have there is religious books. It's like there is no dreams of this. So that's what it was in the Middle Ages. So this omnipotent Christianity will be viewed as idolatry, but the necessity will be to assimilate into the economy, to integrate into the economy, and that is what will drive the Jews into paradoxical thinking and behavior, especially the firmest of them, the Ashkenazim. So here we come to the other side of the coin. As we'll see, the Jews re-enter Europe in the 800s. So they were confined to the edges, to Italy, Spain, and they weren't anywhere else. They weren't allowed anywhere else. And later, as I'll show you shortly, they will be allowed elsewhere. Why? Because the rulers will say it's good for business. Okay, I get that. So that means that if I'm Jewish and I'm moving, let's say, for example, to France or Germany, I have to integrate into the economy. I have to assimilate the culture of my customers. You understand? I'm going to have to pick up the what you do and what you don't do to sell in England. You see what I'm saying? So the economics is what's going to drive whatever assimilatory tendencies there are. Certainly not the intellectual side or the religious side, because there's no room for that. Well, mostly no room for that. But economically, yeah, of course you're going to assimilate into the economy. Okay? On the other hand, it's going to prevent them with certain theological problems that they'll have to respond to through kind of a glorious inconsistency, as I would call it. And this is particularly interesting because it hits the firmest of these immigrants, which is the Ashkenazim, which most of us come from. Who are they? Herein lies the tale. At the beginning of the barbarian period, the Jews, as I told you, lived in the Gothic kingdoms. right? Only here and only here. And after a while, these guys started persecuting them, but only in those two places. And they weren't allowed into the rest of Europe. Let's go to the next one. Here's the great empire of the Franks, the Merovingians as they call it. It's big. It's France and a lot of Germany and Switzerland and so forth. And no Jews, okay? These are the barbarian Catholics from the early Middle Ages. But then, things changed with Charlemagne, the famous emperor who founded the Holy Roman Empire. And he conquered northern Italy, and look how big his empire was. Right? All of France. He conquered Germany and Christianized them. It's very famous when the Saxons weren't converted, he killed them all, and he burned down these whole forests that they worshipped as trees. So he played hardball, Charles the Great. And he was a very smart guy, and when he saw the Jews in Italy, the lands they conquered, and that they're all merchants and they're contributing to the economy, and they have big connections all over the world with trade, and they're bringing importing export all over the place, and he put two and two together, and he says, these guys are going to be like the bees that produce the honey. And therefore he invited the Jews to enter the rest of his empire, and this had Jews enter Europe, okay? Because this is France and Germany, as you can see. This is, and from here it spreads. So it's from Charlemagne really starts the Jews being in the heart of Europe. And as I say before, money talks. Now, the Jews will spread to other parts of Europe because, as I said before, they're viewed as the bees that produce the honey by the rulers. In other words, the king or the queen or the duchess look at the bottom line. And I need money for taxes, and I need money to maintain an army and build a palace and all that other junk. And, you know, the peasants produce so and so much, which a lot of it, by the way, goes to the local nobles, you know what I mean, because whoever's the local nobles until it gets to the top. But trade is the only way you can bring in real money. And I don't have anybody, if I'm Charlemagne, who can deal with Baghdad, with Harun al-Rashid, and the whole Arab Empire over there, bringing the spices and the jewels and all the other fancy stuff that they have over there. But these Jews do. Why? Because Shlomi has a cousin named Oberstein, who has a cousin named Schwartz, who lives in Cairo, who has another cousin named Newman, and that's how it goes. And that's what he did. And that's how the Jews came to play such a vital role in the economy. Okay? And Charlemagne, as I say, kind of babied them because, as I said before, he was a smart guy. You know, I don't know if you know, he was illiterate, and in his old age, he said, it's a shame that I'm illiterate, and he went to elementary school. It's a famous thing. He sat in the school to learn how to read and write. Okay? And his son was Louis the First, Louis the Pious, and he was like really a patron of the Jews, and he even had, let's go to the next one. This would be a cabinet position for Jewish affairs. Take care of the Jews. You understand? Not just their Judorum. It's like Department of Jewish Affairs in a positive way. So in other words, if you're Jewish and you're having trouble with your local officials and they're giving you trouble with import and export, you go to the federal government, so to speak, and they'll clear it away for you. That's what it was. Because it's good for the economy. And it brought them in a lot of money. And indeed, the 800s I'm talking about, the Jews will dominate many, many aspects of trade and they'll prosper tremendously. Which is going to be a problem for the church, because I told you before, the only reason the church said you can leave the Jews alive whatsoever in the theology of the church is they should live a degraded state, like I say, like barefoot gypsies, who are suffering all the time, you see, and then it doesn't turn out that way, because actually this Jewish guy named Schwartz, or obviously, is actually the richest people in town. And that's not the way it's supposed to be. You see? That's not the way it's supposed to be. Now, we know this, because already in the 800s, very famous, Bishop Agavard of Lyon. Lyon being, where there is up the Loire River and a major trade center in France, even today. He writes these books, and he says, what the heck is going on over here? The Jews are having it too good, they're supposed to live worse than us. And instead, they're controlling everything. They're employing us. Right? So this is, you hear a lot of times, like, remember years ago they said Japanese are buying Rockefeller Center. Like that. So the Jews are buying everything, and that sort of thing is long ago in that. And the Jews themselves I always say like this, you don't have to be stupid to be Jewish, but it helps. The Jews shut their mouth off, so it was a big scandal. There was a scandal. There was an up-and-coming prince from a very noble family. Really was tall, blonde hair, blue-eyed. He was a bishop at a church, but they were going to, because he was a nobleman, and they were going to switch and make him a prince, and this, and that, the other. I forget all the details. And he hung around the court, and there were these Jews who hung around the court also, for business and other reasons, and he got in religious discussion with them. And by the time it's over, he got convinced that they're right and the Christians are wrong, and he shot his mouth off, and everybody told him, don't talk like that. And so he said to the emperor, who liked the Jews? He said, I want to go on a special mission to Rome. He said, okay, maybe become a bishop or something like that. Instead, he went to Spain, which is under the Muslims, and as soon as he got over the border, he declared himself Jewish. He had a bris, the whole 9 yards. He became a persecutor of the Christians in Spain. Okay? And he wrote these books in Latin attacking Christianity. Thanks a lot. And saying, thanks a lot. You got this on, you want to get off your chest, but who's going to pay the price? So you can understand which way it's going to go. As I said, Jews will move to many places, including France and Germany. It was all one country under Charlemagne, but later it broke up into different countries. One particular group of Jews settles in what you and I today call northern France and the Rhineland. So the area around Paris and north of that, right here, northern France, and this is the Rhineland over here with the big run there. You probably can't see it, but the Rhine River, runs like that, halfway through Europe. And this is the Middle Ages where all the business is done on rivers because the roads are junk. Correct? So like your serious commerce is done on rivers. So you can imagine if you went in those years in the Rhine River, you see boats going up and down, like the Mississippi was in the 1800s. You understand? So have that in mind. The group of Jews I'm talking about, who settle in this part of the world, end up calling themselves Ashkenazim. This is why they call it the land of Ashkenaz. Now Ashkenaz is the name of a town in Israel, mentioned in the Bible once or twice. But this is how they end up calling this area. They're tiny communities, and they spread in very small numbers to different areas over here. Why small numbers? I'm the only shoe store in town. I don't want another Jew moving in and selling shoes. See? I'm the only one selling this in this area. I don't want another one coming in here. They even have a technical term called marufia in this farm. And the marufia says, it's my Gentile client. You don't have to write to him. And the idea was there wasn't much trade or commerce going on because it was the nobles on the one hand and the peasantry on the others. That's generally what it was. And in the towns you had the craftsmen and the guilds. But the people actually doing import and export and that sort of thing weren't many. That's exactly where the Jews fit in. If I'm Jewish and I'm in this county in France and I'm selling, let's say for example, jewelry, which is an elite niche type of profession, I'm obviously dealing with the princes and the dukes and all that stuff. I don't want another Jew coming in and competing with me. You see? So I live in a town where there are probably 5 Jews, and maybe we get a minyan together, maybe we don't. And that's the way I like it. You understand? And for a Shabbos or Yom Tov, maybe I'll go 10 miles away, 20 miles away to another town, and we'll make a minyan there. And that's how life was lived. So the communities are very small. And therefore it's very remarkable that these people don't assimilate into their surroundings, because I'm the one Jew in town. I'm surrounded by 1,000 people who are Roman Catholic, and I see the Catholic rituals all the time, all over the place, everywhere. And so do my kids growing up. You understand? So how do I get them to ignore all the Christmas commercials and realize it's Hanukkah? It's not always so easy. Okay? And they do it. That's the interesting thing, and they do it. So the Ashkenaz is just very interesting. One of the keys, not the only one, was the cultivation of Jewish scholarship. So let me talk about this for a minute. I'm probably going a little bit out of order, but it doesn't matter. Ashkenaz, what I'm talking about now, will become the headquarters for Jewish cultural insularity. And they're the ancestors of the Hasidim and the culturally insular today. They really are. And this has been the proud Ashkenazic boast down the centuries, for 1,000 years now. We got nothing to do with the outside culture or the rest of it. Yeah, because in those days, if you lived in France and Germany, there is no outside culture. And so, suppose I'm growing up a boy or a girl, and let's say I'm intellectually curious to whatever degree. After all, you can be a Beis Yaakov girl who goes and takes books out of the library also. Right? What if there is no library? So the only thing you can do if you're Jewish is do what? Turn inwards. Look at the Jewish books. Learn Hebrew, read the Bible, read the Talmud, read this, that, and the other. You know, the rabbinical literature, that's all the literature there was. And you kind of zero in it, and you analyze it, and you comment on it, and you talk about it, and this becomes the overall, dominant cultural feature in your life. Because when I meet my cousin at a bar mitzvah, she's doing the same thing. Right? Well, they're not reading the lives of the saints. They're not reading the New Testament. So what are you doing? What are you learning? What do you think about the parsha this week? This is the world of Rashi. This is where it comes out of. You understand? Like, what else do you do? I think people in this argument would go crazy. What do you do? Unless you turn inwards. You do that a generation, another generation, another generation, another generation. That becomes the way of doing Jewish. And even later on, when you're in centuries later, when Europe will have a renaissance and develop a secular culture, all the rest of it, we don't do that. We just spend all our time studying Jewish stuff. And we're not interested in the Goyish stuff. That's what they say. And I'm not saying it's bad, I'm not saying good. It's not what we do. You see? Why? That's what my father did, that's what my grandfather did, that's what my grandfather did, and my Bubby was a famous and holy person, and she really was, and that's all she did. And that's the way you do it. And you can take it down to the year 2025. So the ideal emerges in this particular environment that I'm describing, and precisely have an intention not to assimilate, because there's nothing to assimilate to unless you want to convert your religion. So keep that in mind. The cultivation of Jewish scholarship, therefore, will counter the environment. It's a response to whatever pressures of assimilation. But that doesn't mean that there's no assimilation to the mores of the surrounding population, because here we have all the complexities in the world. It's really great. This is going to sound funny. From Jews in Ashkenaz, in those days, didn't wear a yarmulke even in shul. Right? Here you have the Zorah, the big posek in the 1200s, Ashkenaz. Rabbi Seina B'Tzarfas, Hayosin Maisa Lavarit, Rosh Megullah. They would make brachas and daven all the rest of it. No, the yarmulke wasn't part of what they were. And I think partially because of anti-Semitism, they all shaved. Because you know how that works. Fashions go, beards are in, beards are out, beards are in, beards are out. You know that, right? So it depends which century in Europe you're talking about. Okay? Depends which century. Beards are in, beards are out. So at that time, in the 1000s, 1100s, the beards are out. So you see pictures of Jews. And anyway, you see this now the Jews in Germany complaining the Jews in France are not religion and all the rest of it. But like you said before, Rabbi was saying it, even the rabbis do it. I strongly, strongly doubt that Rashi didn't wear a yarmulke, but I don't know. No, I'm very serious now, because he studied in Germany and all the rest of it, because very pious people did. But the regular Jews didn't. Okay? So it sounds funny to us today to imagine these times of Rishonim, you go into a synagogue in France, and very Jewish and all the rest of it, and then they're bareheaded in the show like a Reformed temple. Okay? They do have close relationships with their non-Jewish neighbors, because how do you not if you're the only Jew living in a town with 500 other people? Okay? If you have a store, you're the only Jew in town, or one of two. I mean, who do you talk to all day long? You understand? Rashi has whole questions about Jews who say, what do I do? My non-Jewish neighbor brought me food on Passover or something like that. They meant well. So what do you do with it? But it goes to show that means they were good relations. You understand? Now, on the other hand, you have the rabbis who are always saying, you have to double down on the cultural insularity and remember that you're Jewish. The litmus test in all this is very famous from recent scholarship is wine. Okay, wine. Because in the Middle Ages, I don't know why, but in the Middle Ages, it seems nobody drank water. I know it sounds funny. Everybody drank wine in these regions of Europe. Herculean amounts, as they're called. And if they drank water, they mixed it with wine. Nobody drank water. And therefore, the viniculture spread like crazy through France, especially in the Rhineland. Even today, they have French and Rhinish wines, don't they? And it's a major source of income. It would probably be the number one.
I don't know. Maybe.
Oh, that's okay. We go. That's all right. It'd probably be that's all right. It'd probably be the number one business in the 11th century. Here's the reason. Is it probably number one in the 11th century? Now, I'm serious. Chaim Soloveitchik, Professor Soloveitchik, big historian, he got into this the last 20 years, and he's published all kinds of books on this subject, including the role of wine in the Middle Ages and all the rest of it. It's crazy, you understand? Like, you see daily rations in monasteries for wine. These guys are knocking off a couple of bottles a day per person, okay? So either everybody was happy in the Middle Ages, or I guess they got used to it, I don't know. But the significance in economic life, here's one of his books, Jews and the Medieval Wine Trade in Medieval Europe. What it really means is like this: Jews and their absence from the medieval wine trade in Europe. Okay? Because everybody has to, by the way, if you're Jewish, you had to make your own wine. So every Jew had to arrange, depending where you live, to own a vineyard or have access to that, or cut a deal with somebody who has a vineyard and will produce X number of wine you need for Kiddush, and for Abdullah and things like that. I mean, you do. Plus, I just told you, people consume wine every day like crazy. So it was like huge. The Jewish problem with wine, though. What was the Jewish? Let's go to the next one. In Jewish halacha, we've always had a problem since the Talmudic era, if not earlier, with wine, because in the Talmud and already before that, they viewed wine as having two problems. Number one, the pagan religions are very big into wine, and they were libations and that sort of thing. In Persia, every time you look up in Zoroastrian Persia, every time you take a sip, you go like this, like you do with the plagues on on the Seder. But then no, you do like this, and that's an offering to God, to one of the gods. You see? So you can already understand long ago, in places like Persia, all the rest of it, you can't touch, you can't have anything to do with the wine of the Gentiles because it's pagan. It's used in pagan ceremonies. And wine was used all over the place in pagan ceremonies. So that's what we call Yain Nesach. So that's already in the Torah. But then they extended this in Masechtas Avodah Zarah, which is all about fighting against assimilation, which means fighting against intermarriage and fighting against becoming too chummy with the pagans. That's what it was. And the number one way of becoming chummy is somebody sitting down having a drink together, right? Going to a bar together or something like that. How do you have any kind of social relationship if you never eat together? Oh, we don't want you to eat together. You see? And so they said, even regular wine, first of all, you don't know for sure if it was used in a pagan ceremony or not. Second of all, even if they just, touch you, you don't want to get too chummy with them. So basically, there were two problems. Either srach avodah zarah, you're afraid that it was used in pagan ceremonies, or it's facts of that, or chasnus, which means intermarriage. Okay? Because a lot of intermarriage comes from that sort of thing. As a result, they said, as is the thing today, any wine that was touched by somebody who's not Jewish, the Jew can't have it. Okay? Now, what do you mean by that? Well, you certainly can't drink it. Really? Well, you just put the kibosh on a lot of, successful business meetings. That's the point. That's what we want. So there's Isra Achila, and you can't drink it. But then there's also Isra Hana in some cases, which is you can't have any benefit from it. So they wanted Jews to stay away from anything having to do with wine, except wine that was totally touched by Jews, and that's the rule today. As I think we're not in the wine business over here, but I bet you, as I'm looking at this crowd, you've all been in Israel, and I bet you, in the last 20 years, you probably went to a winery or two when you're in Israel, because that's what they do with the tourists now. Okay? And if you do, chances are they showed you, if it's a big winery, they'll show you, like it happened to me with my kids. We went to some winery, I forget where it was, and there were 600 wineries before the October 7th. And you see that there's like a walkway, you know, like what do they call that, a catwalk or something, you know, up there. And there was a whole group from a company visiting also. And you see down there are the people actually handling wine. They say they all have to be shomer shabbos. See? Because otherwise they're going to touch wine, it won't be kosher, and they won't be able to sell it, and so on and so forth. Okay? So, there's all these rules with wine, that's my point. And how should I put it over here? It's a big anti-assimilationist ruling. Anti-assimilationist ruling. There was no such thing as booze in the time of the Talmud. Didn't exist in the Middle East. Jews do not encounter whiskey and that kind of business till the 1500s when they end up in Poland. There they encounter it all over the place. It's post-Talmudic, so it's too late to make regulations against it. So there's no laws against booze, but there's a million laws against wine. You see, that's how it works. Because the culture of the Mediterranean, there was no booze in the Mediterranean. I mean, I guess you don't know this. In the Mediterranean countries, you know, all the countries out Mediterranean, and even into France, and you know, I'm up to the Rhine, maybe beyond the Rhine, I don't know exactly, is wine. So you got vermouth, brandy, cognac, you know what I'm saying? Stuff from wine, but not like vodka, and then later on gin and all this kind of, that didn't exist. So the halachas all apply to, like I said before, cognac and brandy, and you know, and different types of wine, all the rest of it, but not the vodka and things of that nature, which the Jews sold. We'll see that later on, big time. So all I'm trying to show you is, it's like me telling somebody today, it's usher to do any online trading or deal with anything having to do with computers. Whoa, you just tied my hands. That's like a major source of economic activity nowadays. That's what they said in the Middle Ages. And the Jews in Ashkenaz had to wrestle with this. And one problem is, as I said before, Avodah Zarah. Well, that was in the Mishnah's time when you had paganism. What about in the Middle Ages when you have Islam and you have Christianity? Interesting. Would you regard Islam as a pagan religion? The Rambam, let's go to the next one. The Rambam says no, but the Ran says yes. It's technical. The Rambam grew up as a Muslim, as you know, now he had to pretend. And so he says, their religion may be false, Muhammad may have been a nut, this is what he says, but they believe in one God. But Rabbeinu Nissim, who was in Spain, the Ran, he said, wait a minute, you, Maimonides, of all people, are the one who created the 13 principles of the faith, Yud Gimel Ikrim. And you said, being a theologian, that whoever doesn't subscribe to the 13 principles is like not Jewish, and is like Avodah Zarah and things like that. And one of the principles of Judaism, which is true, is it's the supremacy of the prophecy of Moses. Lo kam Yisrael kamoshe Navi Amabides Tmunaso, right? Which, if you work it out, it has to be that way, logically, theologically. But in Islam, Muhammad is the greatest prophet. So that makes him an Avodah Zarah. And so what do? So I'm just trying to tell the Jews trying to define themselves, the old rules within the new reality of the Middle Ages, which is Christianity and Islam. How does that work out? Do you regard this as, you know, it's Avodah Zarah, Yayin Nesach, do you do Stam Yenim, or you're afraid of these issues, of those issues? It got very confusing, okay? Now maybe the Rambam would say that you don't have to worry about stuff touched by Muslims in terms of idolatry, but certainly in terms of intermarriage and assimilation and conviviality, that one he would have to agree with. What about Christians? You're living now in Europe. See, in Islam, you're not allowed to drink wine, really. Now, they kind of did on the side, like in the Prohibition in America, but if you're a strict Muslim, you can't have wine. But in Europe you could, and they did. I just told you, Herculean amounts. And so, Now I'm Jewish, and I'm an Ashkenaz Jew, and I'm living in the middle of France and Germany, and it's the 1000s, the 1100s, and all that sort of thing. What do I do now? The Christians are Trinitarians. They say the Father, Son, and Holy Ghost. That sounds like three gods. To Rambam, it's not even a question. Of course they're pagans. Maimonides, Islam is not, but Christianity is. But what about if you're living in Ashkenaz? It's not so simple to adopt that position. Because guess what? The Mishnah says, and the halacha is, in Masechet Avodah Zarah, I know that they're learning that on the Daf Yomi, that if you look at the old text, you're not allowed to do business with a pagan 3 days before and 3 days after the pagan holiday. Okay? Because in those days it would lead them to rejoice and whatever it is. We're talking about it's a rule from the Roman times. Well, if it's Christian, guess what? 3 days before Sunday, 3 days after Sunday, you're out of luck. So what do? And this was a stern necessity. Cognitive dissonance kicked in as a desperate attempt to prevent assimilation and intermarriage, ended up producing a glorious inconsistency. How so? The Ashkenazi Jews had to come up with, like I'm doing now, is Christianity idolatry? No, like that. For business purposes, not. You understand? But for everything else, yes. But it wasn't hypocrisy. They honestly were trying in their minds to work out what they really believed on one hand with like an economic impossibility on the other. It's very interesting. That's why there are many books written on this. Okay? And Jacob Katz, there are many books written on this subject. And they end up saying, well, as far as business is concerned, they're not idolaters, they're just confused monotheists. You see? Which is what all the different religions said about each other. But when it comes to wine, they're idolaters. So don't touch the wine. Don't do business in the wine. Except when they're not. Which means you can't do business with it, but if a guy owes you money and he pays the debt in wine, so you're not turning it into business like a one-time deal so you can sell it and realize it for money. What's going on over here? They're wrestling with boundaries. Okay? They don't want too much assimilation. Even though they could have come up with a heter if they wanted to. They could have said, like some did, that Christianity, when you think about it, is not really idolatry. It is a kind of a monotheism. And now I can go into business and support my family. They wouldn't do it. They wouldn't do it. They're torn. That's why I say really it was a case of being very conflicted. And they denied themselves, really participation in this trade because they're afraid of the assimilation side. Now, there are always a few Jews constantly intermingling with Gentile society, especially the elites. Some of the outside culture had to rub off on them. But the question is, how is it handled? As I've been saying over and over again, the assimilation is pressure is there. What do the Jews do in response to that? Anything? If you want to know what's the most powerful effect of the assimilation pressures of the outside society on the Ashkenazi Jews in the Middle Ages, the answer would be monogamy. Because where'd they get that from? The Bible has polygamy. The Talmud has polygamy, even though they didn't practice it so much. When they come to the Arab Empire, there's polygamy all over the place. And all of a sudden, in the 1000s, in the middle of Ashkenaz, they say, Rabbeinu Gershom said, well, you can't do it anymore. And it's called Cherem Rabbeinu Gershom. Really, 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 nobody has the right to legislate after the Talmud. So what do you mean? Rabbeinu Gershom said you can't do it. That's it. So he said you can't do it. It's not legally binding. And yet it became legally binding, isn't it? Monogamy became like a hard principle with the Ashkenaz Jews, which nobody violates today. I think. Nobody in this audience that I know. But anyway, but no, where'd you get it from? Now there are all kinds of stories and theories and this and that and the other, and I know the stories, I know the theories, but at the end of the day, it's the influence of, see, the Christians did come up with monogamy. You see, that they did come up with. And it's more than that. And let me say this. By instituting monogamy, which the Roman Empire did not have. By instituting monogamy, you do a tremendous amount to raise the position of the woman in society. Because if you're one of 5 wives, it's one thing. If you're one wife and one husband, it's a different thing, obviously. Right? Right? And so, wait a second. You see here, in Ashkenaz, not in Sephardic land, not in the ones that live among the Arabs, in Ashkenaz, a very interesting development in terms of the raising of the position of the woman in the Jewish society in the High Middle Ages. Monogamy is one of them. Another one is you can't divorce the wife against her will, even though the Bible says you can. They pass all these different takanas and stuff like that to enhance the female right to, inheritance, through loopholes and stuff like that. And property ownership and taking oaths in court and all kinds of little things like this. How come? And how come you don't see this in Egypt, in Arabia, in Iraq? And in general, you see, Nashim Chashuvot, in the Ashkenazi society in kind of interesting, almost unprecedented ways. And the reason is actually very simple. They're very cute. I know I've done this before. How do you support a family and raise children in the Middle Ages? There's no banks, and no stock investments. What do? A good parent, decent parents, what do we say, middle class parents, as soon as they have children, they start thinking about the future. And they're not millionaires. So the plan is you have to make the right choices at strategic moments in life, economically speaking. And the first, and maybe the most important of them, marriage. So the kids are all married up at 12, 13, 14. Because you don't want them to grow up and then fall for love marriages because they'll make stupid choices. She'll fall for a good-looking guy, he'll fall for a good-looking girl, and it'll be the wrong match, and it's the Middle Ages, and there's no Social Security, there's no unemployment insurance, there's no welfare. If it doesn't work, you die. And so as a good parent, you say to your 12-year-old daughter, or your 13-year-old daughter, or 14-year-old daughter, he says, we're marrying you off to there's no guarantees in life, but we're giving you the best shot because we're working through the shotgun system, which in those days was highly organized, and it's all economic. You see? And basically, this girl comes from these parents, and let's say they're in this business, and talking tachlis, I'll use modern terminology, just a term. Talking tachlis, like I said, I'm just making this up. They can put away $180,000 for this girl, because they got other kids, So I'm talking about a middle class. That's what it can do. We ain't making a match without a boy. You can also come up with 180. And hopefully, if the shotgun is doing their job right, more than that. So let's say, in a perfect world, they'll find a shidduch, and his side can put up, 280. 180 and 280, you can't live on that for the rest of your life. But it's a starting thing. So they'll get married, but of course, he's 14 and she's 13. So they're going to live with one side or the other, right? And the boy is immediately going to be apprenticed to learn something. And that's all part of the marriage contract. Use uncle or cousin or somebody we know, let's say for example in the lumber business. And they're going to take this kid in, he'll be paid. So out of that 180 and 280, so how much is that all together? It's like, 460. Yeah. So out of that 460, we're going to take 30, for argument's sake, and pay this guy to teach this kid the lumber trade, starting from the bottom. You sweep the floors and you work your way up. Learn the business. And the idea goes that they'll live together, this couple, their kids. Well, guess what? By the time 15, she could have a kid. And by 16, 17, she got 2, 3 kids. It's a fact. And you know as I know, I'm looking, I bet you your great-great-great-grandmothers were like this long ago. But the idea is by the time you get to 17, 18, 19, something like this, he learned the trade. And now, whoever taught it to him, part of the contract was you're not going to compete with me. So you're going to move to some area where there's no Jew in the lumber business, and you'll actually become part of our network. You see? And the cycle will repeat itself because by that time, the 18, 19, 20-year-olds, they have kids, and they got to think about marrying off their children. This is how life lives. Does that make sense? Because there's no such thing as college. Right? How do you do it? I'll say it again. There's no safety net. And I have 5 children, a person say. I can't put $1 million for each kid. And I just told you about a family that could put up some money. No, fortune. Right? And what's the idea? The money, of course, is in escrow. The kids are not touching the money. Correct? The 13, but they're not touching the money. When the boy already is 19 or 20, whatever it is, and looks like he's able to go out and start a business, then, they'll give the money to sink into the business. Makes sense. Okay. All of this, everything I told you, was predicated upon an assumption, which we all know is not necessarily true in life. And what is that assumption? He knows what to do in business. Right? And she does not. Very often it happens, right? I don't know how often, but it could happen that as time goes by, you see this kid is sweeping the floors, and in 5 years he's still going to be sweeping the floors. Right? That's who he is. His family could put up the money, but he's a little yitzvach. That's how it's going to be. And it might be that she might have a head for business. After all, economics has no sexism. Agreed? The bottom line is the bottom line, and business is business. So I can guarantee you, even Tamarashi, after a year or two, when they see which way he's heading, a family council is held. Right? And by the time the discussions are over, all financial money taken out of his thing is put with her. You see? And so we have what you call the Ashkenazic superwoman of the Middle Ages. Didn't happen all the time, it happened once in a while. Okay, don't jump ahead yet. There's one of them. Okay, that's true. The Ashkenazic superwoman of the Middle Ages. Because we have these women that, listen, you're having the babies, and it's true, you have help in the house, correct? Because, maids were cheap. So, that's there. But even so, before toasters, breakfast, lunch, and supper is not push it. But now you're also running a business. But it turns out, she can keep the accounts, and she knows the customers, and she can do this and that and the other. And so don't be surprised if this phenomenon repeats itself a number of times, that you have what you call the rise in the status of woman in the Ashkenazi Jewish communities, because at the end of the day, she's the one making the biggest contribution to the synagogue. Now it's the 10th century, so it's not exactly feminism. So by the time this is over, he says the Kiddush on Friday night, but she says when. They don't start chakras until she shows up. I mean, that's really the way it was. And women were very often the big patrons of learning, yeshivas, and writing books, which you had to pay somebody to do, and all kinds of things like that, because they had the guilt. So is this something assimilated from the Christian society? Like that, yes and no. You understand? Yes and no. It's as much economic necessity as anything else. But the position of the powerful woman is usually associated with the Christian society. You see? Now, this is a statue put up a couple years ago of Lucretia, right? Who was one of these English superwomen, and she was going back and forth with the kings of England and lending money every once in a while. They put her in jail, And then she got out, and then they had to come to her for money again. As a gun business, you can look it up. And in the end, she was framed and killed at the time of King Henry III in the 13th century in England. But before that, she had a real run. And the fact that they put up there, she's in local legends and lore even today. This is in Winchester, Lucretia Winchester. So I guess if you've been in England, go to Winchester, they make this new big statue of her. If the Palestinian riders haven't knocked it down. The idea is, he's entered English history in their memory. You see? Now, by the way, sometimes it can turn out disastrous, as happened in Blois, in France, in 1171, where you had one of these superwomen. And you have to understand, these are, I'm not making myself clear. She can live in the little town of France. She has caravans going here and there. She has agents, right, as you would imagine in an international business, going back and forth. She's getting reports every day in the mail. She's sending out instructions all over the place. She has people in Persia buying stuff over there to bring over here for the Duke and the Duchess and so forth. You have no idea how complex this was. And this Jewish woman, I forget her name, Bella maybe, something like that. She's providing stuff for the Duke in Blois, and the Duchess gets jealous, and she thinks they're having an affair or something like that, which is certainly not true. And by the time it's over, she frames them and said they did a blood libel, they killed a kid, used the blood for Pesach. And by the time that's over, all Jews are burned. And the story is, this happened on the 20th of Sivan, Chav Sivan, which is the same day of Chmielnicki. That's why it's still preserved. And the story is that when they were burned, they offered them a chance to save their lives, that they would convert, and they refused, and they sang Olenu L'Shabeach, and that's how it entered the davening. See? That story, and entered the liturgy, which is why in some nusachs there is no Olenu. And if you're in a certain place in Italy, for example, they don't have, but it's pretty darn universal. And why? Because this powerful woman. So the Christian environment is one in which interesting things can happen among the Jews. Now, as I said before, this power leads to anti-Semitism, and as we know, anti-Semitism assumed horrific proportions in the First Crusade, 1096, when the Crusaders came and wiped out whole communities, or the Jews committed mass suicide. Both happened. The experience, so again, this is very scary, because the Crusades started in 1095 to go to Palestine to recover the Holy Land from the Muslims. And most of the Crusaders left the Jews alone. Most did. But one group started like in Belgium and went down the Rhine, and they were very vicious to the Jews. And they came and they brought like a whole pogrom everywhere. So the local police, the local population was not part of this. And the local sheriffs and everything tried to stop it. And the local bishops sometime or other tried to protect the Jews, all the rest of it. And the emperor happened to be away in Italy fighting the Pope on something at that time. He was out of town. Really. It happened in the summer of 1096. And so it was a perfect storm. And as a result, they all came through and wiped out whole communities. And many Jews were given the opportunity to convert and save their lives and did not. And this seared itself into the memory of Ashkenazi Jewry. And therefore, to them, Christianity is equal to the Inquisition or the Crusades. And it's associated with the martyrdom. Pretty soon in Tisha B'Av, you're going to read several of the keynotes that are associated with the martyrdom. You have all those horrific descriptions of the violence that was going on at that time. And basically from then on, the Ashkenazi Jews are going to double down on the cultural insularity. Then they're going to double down on the, what's the right word? Pride and custom. Let me put it this way. You talk to an Ashkenazi Jew, even today, an Ashkenazi Jew, you say, why do you do this and this practice? My parents did it, my grandparents did it. Well, maybe they're wrong. Don't say wrong. My grandmother gave up her life for Judaism in 1096 and did it happily. So don't tell me she was wrong. And I said, okay, you see? And so this hardwired this experience into the Ashkenazic mentality. And basically, you find The anti-Semitism certainly countered the assimilation. And like I said before, read the keynotes on Tisha B'Av. We call for vengeance. I did this podcast the other day. Rashi, of all people, writes this thing, which is, let's go to the next one. Kill them, chill them, burn them, leave no prisoners, cut them to pieces, destroy them, lo sachaya kol neshama, no survivors. Yeah, Rashi's writing that about the Crusaders, right? Maybe all the Christians by the time he's because if you're living right after that experience, you understand it. What happened to the nice Rashi that I said before? He used to get gifts from his neighbors and gifts to the neighbors. That was before this happened. It's a little bit like the German Jews. A lot of German Jews said, oh, we had great neighbors. And then came the 1930s and 40s, and they didn't have great neighbors. You see? And so there developed really a yawning chasm between Christian and Jew. The hate that they have for us, we reciprocate. And at the core, the problem was an existential one, which was you have a paradox, which makes no sense. Medieval Christendom did not allow anybody to live among them who wasn't Christian. So that's the difference between Christianity and Islam. In the Muslim empire, you could be Jewish or Christian, just a second-class citizen, third-class citizen. But in the Christian countries like Italy and France, only Christians, in fact, only Roman Catholics. And anybody else, either you convert or leave or die. That's it. So the pagans they left, or they were killed, or they died, or they converted. So wherever I go in France and England, everybody's a Catholic, except for some Jews. That doesn't make any sense. Of all the people that should be the exception, it shouldn't be the Jews, the ones that killed Jesus. It doesn't make any sense. Right? And I told you before, and they're not living so bad. Right? And it's not right. We want a homogeneous society where everybody looks like us. There's a tendency in all religions this way. This, as you know, is going on as we speak in Syria, where the Sunnis are trying to kill out all the Druze and all the Alawites, all the others, so that'll be a perfect country where everybody be just like us. And it makes sense from the Christian point of view in the Catholic Middle Ages. It makes sense. So there are terutzim, as I told you before. The Christians have worked it out that this will be, a sign of the degraded state of the Jews. St. Paul says in the New Testament that at the end of days, the cataracts will be removed from the eyes of the Jews and they'll see the truths of Christianity, so we can wait. There are terutzim, but at the end of the day, as they say, the kasha is more than the teretz. The problem made more sense than the answer. And so in the long run, it didn't work. And especially, like I say, when the Jews didn't play their role and live a degraded existence. You see? On the contrary, the Jew was the one who was the bourgeois. The Jew was the one who was the employer. The Jew was the one who was literate. The Jewish woman and the Jewish daughter always dressed above their station. That's all throughout history. Let's see over here. Let's go to the next one. Here's a family having aggadas. They're very well dressed, the women. Okay? This is the Jewish guy, because this was the Streinbull of the Middle Ages. It really was. The Jewish hat. He's dressed very well. These are the Christians with whom he's debating. They don't come in tatters and barefoot and all the rest of it. You understand? The rabbis didn't look like the and that's not the way it's supposed to be. So how do you explain this? By the way, let's go to the next one. Can never figure this out. Are these the maids who are not Jewish, or is this the housewife and the daughters? They're cleaning for Pesach, right? And she's and they're really cleaning for Pesach. She's washing the ceiling. Look at that. And she's scrubbing the floor. But you can never tell exactly in those pictures which one is Jewish, which is the employees. But assimilation happens, it always does. That's why the church in the Middle Ages will have to issue the ruling that the Jews have to wear a yellow star or a yellow something or other. What does that tell you? The Jews weren't dressing like Jews. You see? There's a Jewish lady, there's a Jewish guy, well dressed for that time, but you got to wear the marker. What does that tell you? They're wearing Brooks Brothers. Otherwise, listen, if they're dressed like Hasidim, you wouldn't have to wear anything. Right? If they dress like, Ner Israel, you don't need a sign. If he's got payas, you don't need a sign. But he doesn't. And she doesn't. And like I said before, the Christians Europe has always been a class society. There's the lower class, the middle class, the upper class, the working class, and so on and so forth. And each one of these groups has always had their own culture. And so in Europe, if you're a member of the middle class, you don't dress like the upper class. You understand? And that was definitely true before the 19th century. And if you're Jewish, no matter what class she's in, any woman who can, she'll dress like a duchess. If she can. And then the Christians don't like that. Like, what are you doing? What are you doing? So, the Christians do enact all kind of penalties. You have to dress this way. You have to wear this clothing. There are very strong penalties if there are sexual relations between a Jew and a Christian. Both sides don't like, but the Christians will really come down on you. And then we have the rise of the blood libel and the pogroms that it brings. You have the whole second half of the Middle Ages is very bad, full of violence against the Jews, culminating in the Jews being kicked out of Europe. So that's what happened in the Middle Ages. By the time you get to 1492, 1500, Jews are kicked out almost all of Europe, all of Western and Central Europe. One last point. What about the question of intellectual assimilation? What did the Jew pick up from the Christian? The Ashkenazim grew up in a culture, as I told you before, which valorized cultural insularity because you didn't have any secular stuff outside. So if you go to, let's go to the next one. Here are the two poster boys. He is the poster boy for non-insularity. Maimonides was a big rabbi, you know that, but guess what? He was also a big doctor, big philosopher, big Arab intellectual, right? Notice he had a very good secular education. Now let's see Rashi. No secular education, wasn't interested. What did Rashi do his whole life? He spent the whole time very happy. I mean, he made a living, he had a job, but what did he do intellectually? Spent the whole time composing his famous commentaries on the Bible and the Talmud, which are classics even today. Aren't you interested in reading a French novel? He wasn't interested in it. He didn't hurt anybody. He was intellectual his way. See, he's the poster boy for modern orthodoxy, quote unquote. And he's the poster boy for yeshivish. And that's the way it is. In other words, the Sephardim was this way in Spain, the Ashkenaz was this way in Ashkenaz, as I told you before. So, it's the source of the Hasidic, of the yeshivish, you know. Now, in America today, it's a big question. How culturally insular should Orthodoxy be? In fact, it's the big question. In other words, when you think about it, how much do you assimilate from American culture? How much do you assimilate from modern Western culture? There are many varieties, as we all know, of Orthodox Judaism today, from extreme right to extreme left. I'm not talking about the non-Orthodox. They went a different direction. I'm talking about the ones that regard themselves as Orthodox. How insular are you? How insular do you believe you should be? And we live now, as you know, unfortunately, in a current wave of anti-Semitism ever since October 7th. We know this. Is the current wave of anti-Semitism going to act as a counter or a corrective to the assimilation among American Jews? Tricky question. Some Jews, since October 7th, have moved back into Judaism, or at least Jewish identity to some extent. Professor Wertheimer is publishing a book or something like that, or a big article on this. You know, from the conservative, from the JTS, he went across the country, and we all know this. The whole question of the Gaza war has polarized Jews, and some have moved this way, and some moved that way. Not many have stayed where they were. Okay? So many Jews, because they don't want to be isolated among their working group, they'll cuss out Israel also. And many have doubled down and said, because I see my colleagues are all anti-Israel, I'm embracing my Jewish identity, I see you're not my friends anymore. Goes two ways. Goes two ways. Okay? Back then, the Jews assimilated certain ideas from the Christians around them with profound consequences for an inner core of Torah culture, which is interesting. First of all, the Bible itself. In the Talmud, they're not into the Tanakh. They don't read the Bible. Right? Not intense, but, you know, the Christians are coming to you every day and asking you about Bible, so you better learn it. So what do we find in Christian France? Rashi and the Rashbam and him and him. All of a sudden you have a whole genre of Mefarshim on the Bible, which is a response to the Christian environment. And the Jews are always saying, we know Hebrew, you don't. We know the real meaning of stuff, you don't. Okay? And the Rashbam is always debating with the priest and his commentary, and so on and so forth. That's what you call constructive response to the challenge of assimilation. And finally, you have the question of dialectic. I'll do this fast because the hour is late. Rashi wrote the commentary of the Talmud, and he wrote it in a non-dialectical style, which is absolutely necessary for a preliminary. I'm reading a page of the Talmud. I don't know what the heck these words mean. Rashi will tell you what these words mean. And let's say, for argument's sake, Rabbi Akiva said this is kosher. Rashi, he's saying it's kosher. Now, elsewhere in the Talmud, maybe 100 pages away, maybe 2 pages away, Rabbi Akiva says this is not kosher, it's treif. And Rashi will tell you over here, he's telling you over here, it's treif. What does Rashi not do? You have 2 contradictions over here. Because he was trying to clear the field. First, you got to know what you have in front of you. You get it? And that took a lifetime. And he only was 65 when he died. So just to concentrate on explaining what you have in front of you was a big task. After he died, his grandchildren and people like that in France in the 1100s, they said, no, Rashi was a great man, he was a grandfather, the greatest person ever lived, but he's wrong, because he left out the dialectical interpretation. Here he said it's kosher, here he said it's treif. What's going on? Now dialectics very simply means like this. I say that I saw Oberstein yesterday in Baltimore. Bert Miller says, I saw Oberstein yesterday in Washington, D.C. It sounds like one of us is wrong or lying. Comes along, I don't know, right? He comes along and he says, hold it for a second, okay? I know more than you. In the morning, Oberstein was in Baltimore. In the afternoon, he traveled to D.C. Turns out that neither of us is arguing with each other. We have now done the thesis, antithesis, and the synthesis, and we have a higher truth. Because if you just would have heard me, I'm not lying. I said Oberstein was in Baltimore yesterday. That is true. It's not the whole truth. If you would have heard him, you would have think he's in D.C. all day. But by combining the two, you end up, that's called dialectics. You understand? So that's what they do, that's what the Tosafos ended up doing. That's called the dialectical jousting. On one side is Rashi, on one side is Tosafos. Where did they get this from? All I know is that in France, go ahead, next one. Dialectics was a big, popular intellectual endeavor in the 10, 1100s and 1200s in the French universities of Europe. So the big question that all the historians are always asking is, did A get it from B, did B get it from A? It almost doesn't matter. What you see over here is, and by the way, this is the way you do in yeshivas still today, the dialectical way. The hour is late, so I'll just end with there is assimilation, but there are also responses. And the sign of a living organism is it can always innovate to meet challenges. But with that, good night.